Quickly, by way of introduction, I'm Rod Carr, and I get to chair New Zealand's Climate Change Commission. The Commission was established late last year by Act of Parliament without objection, and the Commission's responsibilities are pretty clearly defined. So we are not all things climate change. There's lots of work for lots of other people in addressing the agenda under climate response and climate action. But the piece that the Climate Change Commission has been tasked with is developing a series of emissions budgets that would put New Zealand on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. And those budgets are in 5-yearly blocks, so 2025, 2030, 2035. And more importantly, each of those budgets has to be supported by a series of emissions reduction plans. In other words, not just a budget, but a how-to workbook that will give government advice on how we are to achieve those budgets, which would be consistent with our long-run target and our international obligations under the Paris Agreement. The other thing the Commission is responsible for is monitoring the National Adaptation Plan, which is to be prepared by the Ministry for the Environment. So once adopted by the government of the day, that plan is the second part of climate action. And that one thing is to manage and reduce our emissions to make the planet a better, safer place. And the other is to prepare New Zealand for a windier, wetter, warmer world, which is certainly coming our way. So the board is made up of 7 commissioners, and I get to be the chair. The board are responsible for employing a chief executive who is responsible for the staff of the commission who get to do all the technical work. The commission itself is independent of the government and therefore is not beholden to give advice which the government of the day might find either desirable or acceptable. The advice we need to give has to be prepared after engaging with stakeholders and formal consultation, and it's advice that needs to be evidence-based. So from the Commission's point of view, how we go about forming our advice is as important as the advice which we offer. And the role of the board is effectively to exercise judgment when the science runs out. If things are scientifically evident and the action unambiguous, then the board has a limited role except for quality assurance. But where judgment is required, then the board of 7 will exercise that judgment in the formation of advice to the government. Well, I think the first part is I've always believed that what is monitored gets managed, and that until you have articulated what success looks like or what the goal is, it is very hard to know whether you're on a path to achieving that goal. So one of the visions for essentially the Zero Carbon Bill, which was changing the Climate Change Response Act, was to make sure that the targets, the definition of success was clear, and then to put in place an institutional arrangement which could monitor progress towards that goal and have some instruments such as plans and budgets and monitoring and transparency that would help governments of the day make hard but good choices. I think it plays out in several respects. One is the very fact that we have the Act is a demonstration of national commitment and political will. So that's a plus. Not having it leaves that vacant. Having it answers that question. Secondly, Although we are advisory to government in a Western liberal democracy, it is important that elected officials make the hardest of choices involving the biggest trade-offs. Although we are advisory, our advice is given transparently. In other words, it's not behind closed doors that we give our advice. The advice is made public so all New Zealanders can see what we were advising the government of the day to do. And the government of the day isn't obliged to take our advice, but if they choose not to, then they have a statutory obligation to say what they're going to do instead. So there is no free pass to a long holiday. There is an obligation either to take advice or act and explain why. So let's focus on agriculture because it is important.
Yeah.
Nearly half of all New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions have been attributed to biogenic methane emissions, which is a byproduct of ruminant animals eating grass, basically. It is a fact that New Zealand's agricultural sector feeds anywhere between 40 and 100 million people, depending on how you think about the proteins and calories that we create and sell to the world. It is also true that under the Paris Accord, there's explicit reference to climate change response not causing disruption in the supply chain of food to a growing and hungry population. So the agricultural sector, mindful of that and mindful that methane, while a greenhouse gas, behaves quite differently from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, entered into discussions with government, which led to an initiative called Hei Waka Ekanoa, which is essentially the agricultural sector trying to get a regime which makes individual farmers accountable for on-farm emissions. Now, if there is such agreement that we can estimate farm by farm what the emissions are and have plans for emissions reduction at farm level, then that is a regime that the farming industry would prefer to one which essentially either levies or taxes at a higher level in the system the emissions which they believe they can control and should be responsible for. So we have engaged with various parts of the agricultural sector, those non-government organisations, the co-ops and advocacy and representative groups, partly to build our understanding about the sector, also to engage with them about solutions to the challenging question of reducing methane emissions from essentially pastoral grazing, because that's the unique problem in New Zealand. Methane emissions occur, but they occur differently depending on whether animals are barn-fed or pasture-raised, and our animals typically are out eating grass rather than eating nutrients and supplements in a barn. Yeah, so enforcement is an interesting thing. So as I mentioned, we are advisory in nature, and it's for the governments of the day to adopt such plans and other instruments that we might advise. So the Commission may reach the conclusion that some sort of regulation, rather than just merely emissions pricing, is necessary in order to achieve a budget or targeted outcome. Inevitably, it should be for the government, the elected representatives of the people, to decide where the boundary is between what is desirable and what is mandated as required in our society. For example, it may be that the Commission recommends that we phase out the importation of high-emitting internal combustion engine vehicles. And we would need to provide that advice to a government, and a government would need to decide if it was prepared to introduce such a phase out. The alternative is that you could have given a statutory body the authority to regulate in such a way. The decision was made at the time that that was a power that was best reserved to elected representatives rather than devolve to an independent authority. So I think in the meantime, we should trust that our elected politicians will make hard choices wisely, given good evidence-based advice? Well, we would presume so, that it was passed without objection when it became legislation. There's no reason to believe that all sides of the political spectrum don't accept that the climate is changing. That seems to be now established science. That the climate is changing because there are higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That seems to be science beyond dispute. That humans have added to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in this cycle of the carbonization of the atmosphere and the acidification of the oceans. It's not that the planet hasn't had higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. It has had higher levels. It's just we weren't around at the time and might not be around next time they get to that level. So the contribution that the burning of fossil fuels has made to the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is more about the speed with which it has been accumulating and the forecast of the consequences in a disorderly manner, which now give rise to the agenda that means we need to take action. It would have been easier if we had taken action 30 years ago. We need to take action now, and the longer we leave it, the harder and more disruptive it will become. Well, the Act makes it very clear that in preparing our advice, so that's the process of engagement and consultation and what we choose to put in our advice, we must consult with the iwi Māori. We must have regard to the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles, and we must take that into account in the advice we prepare. The board itself, the deputy chair of the board is Lisa Tumahai, who is kai whakahaere of Ngāi Tahu, and the board staff itself includes specific roles and individuals tasked with engaging with Māori and making sure that we see our advice through that lens of Te Ao Māori. Obviously, the judgment will be made in the future as to how effective we have been at casting that lens of partnership and participation on the advice that we give.
That makes sense. And then moving on to about the economy, the changes that are required to meet the zero carbon goals will have a large impact on the New Zealand economy. So the changes proposed may present disproportionate strain with some businesses. What measures will be implemented to support businesses in their transition to comply with the Act?
Right. So it's not so much to comply with the Act. What it will be is to comply with what the government of the day decides in the emissions reduction plans and the national adaptation plan. So in preparing our advice, we are required to take into account the distributional impact if that advice was to be adopted. So that's in terms of the distribution across households of different economic abilities, regional distribution across New Zealand of where consequences may be largest, and the distribution certainly across different socioeconomic groups. So we're required to give consideration to that in preparing our advice. I think we have to be absolutely honest that your indication is correct. The transformation from a carbon-emitting industrial structure, which is embedded in everything that we produce and how we produce it and what we consume and our preferences around consumption. That transformation is very, very substantial. It will change over 30 years what we do and how we do it. It will change what we consume and our preferences around future consumption. Not all losses can be compensated for. It is not possible that everybody is as well off or better off than they are today or would be tomorrow. There will be sectors of the economy that are smaller or disappear. And there will be other sectors of the economy that become larger and more viable. That's part of what we have to evolve, but we do have to be honest that all losses cannot be compensated for. The challenge for our advice and the government of the day is what are the appropriate levels of compensation and who should receive it. Well, of course, it's quite challenging to be quite brutal about it. I mean, I've been around finance markets, budgets, government accounts for 40 years, and I've seen nothing like this. So anybody who can give you an answer that says, and here's how it's all going to turn out, is taking a big bet. What we even don't know today is how much of what we observe out there right now is transient, i.e. passing, and how much is permanent, will represent a new trajectory for how we live our lives. So take the working from home phenomena. There's no doubt that in the last 6 weeks, many people have moved through a steep learning curve on how to use existing technology to do meetings such as this. So in 6 weeks, we've done what it might have taken 6 to 16 years to do, to get massive numbers of people online, working from home, studying from home, engaging with others in a level of comfort and convenience that we knew was there, but kind of hadn't been accessed at scale and speed. I don't think we're going to unlearn all of that. But does that mean that all the people who are currently working from home will stay working from home? No, I don't think so. I think there will be people who revert to office-like working conditions, the same way every student who's been learning online for the last 2 or 3 months isn't necessarily going to decide learning online forever is a great substitute to the social experience of being in a class or a tutor or a hall of residence. So I think we will see some skills and capabilities that have been developed accelerate some underlying trends. And we have certainly seen some underlying trends of weak businesses and weak business models that have failed fast. And I think that's the case. It was interesting reading an article in the New York Times about the US coal sector, where basically as a result of the fall in demand for electricity, and the massive reduction in the cost of both wind and solar renewable technology, there is now no longer a business case to build a new coal-fired power station in the United States on pure economics. It's like, that doesn't work anymore. And in fact, as a result of the fall in demand for electricity, a number of older coal-fired power stations are being turned off because they're more expensive to operate than the newly commissioned renewables power generators. So we're already seeing in America where we kind of say, oh, they don't like the Paris Accord, they're not doing anything about climate change. Actually, their CO2 equivalent emissions have fallen 15% since 2005. Ours have increased.
Okay. And is that just solely on an economic basis?
Pure economics. It's not like they passed laws that said you had to scrap your old coal-fired. It's just they don't work anymore. The economics of it has driven them out of the market. First of all, I think what happens in the next weeks and months is probably more important than what was announced yesterday. That there's a lot of detail, not just to be revealed, there's a lot of detail to be worked out. And as a consequence of that, we've seen, for example, the $3 billion of shovel-ready projects. We haven't even seen the list of those projects, so it's really hard to say whether a climate change lens has been passed over that schedule of projects. There's a $12 billion worth of infrastructure projects were announced in February, some of which did include upgrades to what might be thought of as a greener future. So my view would be, let's not be quick to assume the horse is bolted, although the horse is stamping its feet in the corral at the moment. We need to make sure that we exert influence about what happens in the future around funds that are being tagged or earmarked. We need to make sure decision makers are held accountable for their climate response embedded in those choices. So classic and challenging might be this $400 million set aside to replace the Cook Strait ferries, right? It would, in my view, be an appalling decision to buy diesel ferries.
Mm.
I would rather that we put up with the old guys for another few years until renewables resource ferries were an option, whether that's biodiesel, whether that's hydrogen, whether that's electric. That if we lock in another 60 years of diesel emissions crossing Cook Strait, that would be a failing of policy.
So just to understand the Commission role, something like that advice, you would be the one to advise government on a decision kind of in that realm?
Well, our advice is largely medium term and embedded in these emissions reduction plans.
Okay, right.
So it's slightly higher level than picking on particular projects.
Yeah, okay.
But if we felt sufficiently about something, we might choose to write to the minister, as we did when we wrote on the 7th of April outlining 6 principles against which we thought these COVID-19 infrastructure projects should be evaluated. And the first principle was look at it through a climate change, climate action lens. The second principle was if you're going to have to do something later in response to climate adaptation or mitigation, bring it forward and do it sooner. The third principle was you need to do this stuff in partnership with iwi Māori.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth principle was around training for skill sets that will be required in the 21st century, not skill sets being made redundant from the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
There was also the don't take your foot off the pedal of the ETS reforms so that price can play a part in response. And finally was we need better measures of progress and success than just the old measure of busyness as represented by GDP. We need carbon footprints and measures of emissions avoided, as well as the return on investment or measures of gross domestic product. Right, so the emissions trading scheme is currently the subject of a bill before Parliament to reform it. And the reforms are in several ways. Some of it is a fix-up of a broken scheme, and some of it is to enhance the scheme to make it better than ever. And the biggest enhancement is what's called a cap. So the actual number of units available to be traded is to be capped, and that stops the creation of an infinite number of new units, which debases the value of the existing units.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result of the history of the scheme, there are about 120 million NZUs on issue, and each NZU or NZ unit entitles the owner to emit 1 tonne of CO2 equivalents.
Okay.
So if you're an emitter, you need to buy those units to offset your emissions and surrender them. Mm-hmm. And if you grow trees, which sequester carbon from the atmosphere, you get given units that reflect the amount of carbon captured in your growing trees. So essentially the scheme has an overhang of units that have been issued in the past that creates a bit of a bank. And the challenge is, how do you reduce that overhang? Because it is a threat to the value of a unit to have essentially a massive excess supply hanging around. But how do you also make sure there are sufficient units that you don't crash the economy because essentially you rapidly move prices? And what we know when you move prices too rapidly is that there are windfall gains to people who happen to be in the right place, but also there are unavoidable burdens which fall to those who can't move out of the way fast enough. So we need a price path that says reduce your emissions and do it faster than you might have thought you were going to, and start doing it now, but we're not going to bankrupt you so long as you're on that path. And that path is consistent with our emissions budgets, which are in themselves consistent with net zero by 2050. Well, what can I do about this? What's my part in this? You know, I'm not an elected politician. I'm not a business leader. I'm not a business owner. I'm not a fund manager chucking other people's money around. So what's my part? The first answer that I have is all of us, me, you guys, your friends, we've all got a part to play. Every time we go out and buy something, we're voting for more of that thing, right? So every time you choose how to spend your money, a little bit of it or a lot of it, the production system responds to that. So if you choose to buy things with high amounts of emitted carbon embedded in those products and services, then we'll keep doing that stuff, I promise you. So what you choose to buy actually is the vote you make every day that can affect the future. The mink farms didn't go out of business because they ran out of rich people. They ran out of people who wanted to wear mink coats. Right? So don't underestimate the power that you and your friends have to change consumer preferences, and that will rapidly change what business makes available and offers to sell you. So that's the first. The second thing is we can, as voters in a democracy, choose politicians who are up for this game, and they can be of any part of the political spectrum. They don't have to be in a particular party, but holding individual elected representatives accountable for their choices on our behalf is another way that each one of us individually can actually influence decision makers. The third one I say is that we all have parents, right? And you might not be the decision maker, the political leader, the business owner, the manager of the firm, but certainly uncles, aunts, parents, grandparents are. So lean on them, right? And also, often we are employees. And as employees, we can influence the choices our employers make. So as consumers, as workers, as voters, and as family members, you've got 4 lines of attack already before you go marching in the streets. And do the marching in the streets thing as well, right? Because there is no doubt that in our democracies, visible displays of support for things we want more of and visible displays for less of the things we don't like does influence our society. That's something we can say about New Zealand that not everybody can say about the countries they live in. So I think it is fascinating that it was essentially Gen Zero 2.5 years ago that kicked off what became the Climate Change Commission. That's a pretty quick cycle for starting an action and getting an outcome. So well done on all of them and all of you.